Hello, welcome to PSR, People Speaking Rail. Happy New Year to everyone. Good to see you, Joanna. Did you have a good break here for the holidays?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I went home to West Virginia. Actually, my parents live in North Central West Virginia, so um, whenever I go out of town, there are two, like, whether it's my parents or my in-laws. I'm sorry, it's like too much information now, but um, but I know that there's a CSX line like running kind of nearby where my
Mhm.
parents live, and so I hear the freight train whistle. I'm like, it's a CSX train that's coming. So
Yeah,
that was exciting. But anyway, how were your holidays?
yeah, just fine. Stay around here in Dallas. I mean, that's what I was thinking when you brought up West Virginia. I'm like, that's a good railroad state there. Move a lot of coal through
Hmm.
there, of course. So that's good. Keep tabs on CSX. So what we have today, maybe a little bit less news than would typically be the case, but we're going to talk a little bit about outlook for safety legislation in 2024, which, based on reading your article, may not come to fruition. Talk a little bit about the Red Sea situation. Talk a little bit about rail cars. Going to hear more about rail cars later this week with Greenbrier reporting, and those are kind of the main topics we have to talk about today. If anyone's not already signed up for the Railroad newsletter, we have a newsletter that goes out every Thursday. You can subscribe to that as well as the other newsletters. Go to freightwaves.com/subscribe. Scroll all the way down at the bottom to the left is where you're going to find that rail newsletter be in your inbox every Thursday. So be sure to do that if you're not signed up for that already. And with that, want to hit on our first topic here, which is, will Congress pass any rail safety bills in 2024? You wrote this up, on New Year's Day, apparently. And so read through this morning, and I wasn't convinced that there was going to be um, Congress was going to pass any rail legislation, but I think after reading this, I'm more convinced that maybe it's not likely. Was that the impression that you got from the people that you talked to?
I get the sense. So it was interesting, like the various people I had talked to in the story. I get the sense from the unions. Speaking with Transportation Trades Department and actually also Smart TD, which I wasn't able to include because I talked a little bit later. But I get the sense that there is, I don't want to say an uphill battle, but that there does need to be work done, mainly because lots of it because it's an election year, and and it wasn't just it wasn't just Transportation and Trades Department that said it, but also Association of American Railroads, I think, said it, that or someone else did, that with it being an election year, you have a lot of you have potential legislation moving forward in the first half of the year, but then the second half of the year, there's so much attention being brought on, to the presidential elections. Actually, now that I think about it, it was the consultant that mentioned the election year issue,
Mm-hmm.
and not AAR. But it was interesting too because when I spoke to AAR about it, they were they were actually fairly cautious in their remarks in saying that uh, that the two Senate senators, J.D. Vance and Sherrod Brown, they're still very interested in getting some sort of legislation moved forward, and so so no one's really quite saying that a safety bill will or rail safety bill will or won't happen, but it's not, it sounds like either way, you kind of prepare for both scenarios that it could happen and couldn't happen, but also uh, being prepared with the idea that you really gotta gotta push if you want something to happen. That's kind of what the impression I got from people.
Yeah, I mean, I guess after that East Palestine derailment, it got to be such a big news story with all the pictures of the smoke from the controlled burn that would have thought that there would have been some kind of act of Congress last year. Now that we're into the election year, you have that shortened window that you describe in the article, and it just doesn't seem likely. I mean, aside from Ohio and Pennsylvania, because East Palestine is right on the border of Ohio and Pennsylvania. It just doesn't seem like, to me, it's like the kitchen table issue that people are going to be focused on this year. I mean, it does seem likely that maybe you get some additional rules coming out of the FRA, which regulates the railroads on the issues of safety. So potentially, more guidance as far as the hot box detectors. I think might be potential that you'll have a crew size law that requires you to have a minimum 2-person train crew in the consist, and those things. But it just to me, I mean, I would sort of agree with the sort of the premise of the article that it seems unlikely that there's going to be safety legislation. I mean, those the Republican House leaders, so they want that report, that final report from the NTSB on East Palestine, exactly what happened there. And because it was such an unusual situation that those wheel bearings heated up to such a degree in such a short number of miles, such a small number of miles. So they want to figure out exactly what happened. So there, any legislation would be to address those specific issues so those things don't happen again. You've talked about, earlier on some of your other articles about how CSX had a derailment that seemed to almost mirror Norfolk Southern in terms of the cause, at least as far as we know. I mean, investigation is still taking place, but as far as wheel bearings, heating up. So I think that one remains to be seen. So we'll continue to watch that. We also had a article that was just kind of an infographic on the FreightWaves website on the number of injuries. And I thought this was kind of a funny one to me, because this is injuries. So this is reported by the FRA and the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And I sort of get the premise that you sort of make the argument that railroads are the safest form of surface transportation, but some of the, comparing it to some of these industries that have nothing to do with it. And this is the frequency of injuries per 200,000 employee hours. And we're saying here that the railroads have fewer injuries per 200,000 employee hours than all these other industries, including one of the worst is grocery stores. I assume those are, accidents at the meat slicer. But to me, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because it's not the number of injuries; it's the severity of the injuries. Actually, it was surprised to see air transportation, up at the top there. I mean, my understanding was that commercial air travel is the safest way to get anywhere. I mean, some years there's absolutely no one dies in the United States and on a commercial airplane, and those that do, it's just heart attack in the wrong place at the wrong time. But that's maybe air transportation includes private planes and those things. But that was kind of an infographic that maybe needed a little bit more context in terms of the severity of the injuries. At least that was my perception. Did you have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think having a little bit more context would be helpful in terms of what constitute as a reportable injury, and that's actually something I think that the railroad companies have argued in terms of not so much injuries, but just like accident data. Like when you're talking about an increase of accidents, like is it like a big accident or is it like a little sort of I would say little accident. I'm trying to think citation. I think that's what they're talking about. Like I think Union Pacific, for instance, when they when the Federal Railroad Administration was kind of pointing out like an increase in not citations, but just sort of I can't think of the word right now. It's the new year, but yeah, it's just like an increase in sort of noticeable errors or whatever. Like Union Pacific sort of says, oh well, you don't really know how severe that is. So I guess with this accident, with the injury data, it would be interesting to know exactly what constitutes as an injury. So for starters, but actually, if I could just make one quick point about the rail safety bill, going back to that, there was a quote that I didn't put in, and maybe I probably should have put in, but I wasn't able to get confirmation on it in time. So, or not so much confirmation because that's really more of an opinion quote, but it was interesting because one of the sources someone had spoken to had said, we're even though you have questions about whether a rail safety bill will move forward in 2024. You're also sort of one accident away from rail safety bill getting pushed
Mhm.
forward, which
Mhm.
sounds kind of sounds kind of a little sad. But at the same time, it is true. I mean, God forbid if there's another event like East Palestine, you can be sure that
Mhm. Mhm.
uh, there'll be forces that will be trying to move things much more quickly than a year ago, or maybe not more quickly,
Yeah,
but
I
just
mean, yeah,
more.
great point there. I mean, usually when there is a big safety legislation, it is a result of some big, accident. I mean, it was the Chatsworth, California, that gave rise to the positive train control. It was the Lock McGontic that gave rise to additional regulations surrounding tank cars, the head shields, the coils and insulation, all those things. Um, and potentially the East Palestine gives rise to new rules on hot box detectors, but it remains to be seen. But that's a good point. I mean, that anything could happen that really is another catalyst for that. Want to move on to talk about rail cars. So later this week, Greenbrier is going to report earnings. They always sort of the report the first week of January. Always when I was a stock analyst, so had a hard time with that one, clearing the cobwebs out of my head middle of January. So there's a good article written by Dick Kloster that's on progressive railroading, which he provides I should mention who he is, founder of Integrity Rail Partners. He's been around the industry a long time, knows the rail car manufacturing industry well. So I always read that article when it comes out every year. I think it's an annual one. And he's saying he expects 41,000 new rail cars to be built. That's down from about 45,000 this year. We don't have the final numbers on that. Those will come in a week or two. And the preliminary forecast for 2025 is 43,464. So let's go from 45,000 to 41 to 43,000. Those strike me as expectations that are not wildly bearish or bullish. You sort of think of replacement demand as, let's in rough numbers, 1.6 million rail cars. They last about 40 years on average. Tank cars not as long as some other types of freight cars, but that gets you about 40,000. And then there's some, obsolescence or moving to higher capacity cars. So 40 to 45,000 roughly is kind of the average. But then he goes into some detail about some of the specific car types, saying, box cars, order rates fallen, but retirements are up and capacity is still constrained on box cars. That's been a shrinking component of the rail car fleet. Covered hoppers still has a large backlog of 30,000 cars. Some of those are multi-year orders. Retirements there are increasing. So covered hoppers primarily used to move grain and other things that can't be plastic pellets and other types of freight that can't be, get wet from the rain. And then tank cars, he's expecting deliveries of 10,500 in 2024, up 20% from the 3-year average. And they are saying he supports that. He says some of those data there supports higher lease rates, replacement demand for flammable cars, some age profile in several segments. So almost looking at that, I mean, it makes me kind of bullish. I just his comments on the tank cars, which they believe the freight car manufacturers earn a higher margin on the tank cars, makes you a little bit more bullish, I would say, on Trinity's year, maybe on Greenbrier's year. They both manufacture tank cars, and on GATX, which leases a lot of the tank cars. So anything else you're expecting from Greenbrier when they report on Friday?
Yeah, I don't think so. It's I you know from what I remember, from the last series of earnings calls, you know, of course they're all going to say that they're going to emphasize the positive, but it didn't it didn't seem that any of them were anticipating um, you know uh, significant any sort of like market downturns, I guess, in the sense of like and being able, I think there was um, a sense of that things will only get better. Of course, I know, like I said, usually put a positive spin on on those earnings calls, but but there wasn't any um, there wasn't really so much of a comment, sort of a cautionary, like, okay, well, measured.
Mhm.
I guess sometimes when executives speak, like sometimes they'll put a positive spin, but then there's something else that's kind of a measured, like, well, there are, with these caveats, but I didn't really get a sense of caveats in the last go around. So of course, Greenbrier, as they report early because their fiscal year runs a little differently. So I think
Mhm.
this is like the second quarter of 2024, the earnings that will be releasing this Friday. But yeah, it'll probably. I don't really. I think what Dick Kloster said was probably will probably be in line with what we could hear from Greenbrier and the others in the next coming weeks.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if they provide their own forecast. I mean, sometimes they'll put it up at like 50,000 instead of
Mhm.
something in the 40s. Maybe my main question would be, I mean, the rail productivity seems to have improved with the higher service levels. I mean, in theory, that
Mhm.
reduces the demand for rail cars because the ones in the field are being used more productively. So they'll probably get a question on that. I want to move on to the Red Sea situation. We have lots of articles up on FreightWaves.com about the Red Sea. This one written by Greg Miller just after Christmas, but Greg, putting out a lot of good articles on this that really help you keep up to speed. And what's interesting is some of these different shipping lines behaving differently. As Maersk and CMA CGM headed back to the Red Sea. This was after this Operation Prosperity Guardian, where you have the U.S. military and its allies, protecting these vessels to avoid this 1 to 2 week additional transit time around the Cape of Good Hope. But then you have other lines, MSC and Hapag-Lloyd, continuing to avoid that region near Yemen, where the vessels are being attacked by rebels. And what's kind of interesting, too, is that these annual, contracts largely renew May 1st, and this could impact those negotiations. My colleague, our colleague Henry Byers, did a webinar, last week on the impact of this, and that we've seen in Sonar. And one of the interesting things was that the volume of is that the volume of bookings from China to Germany. This is primarily China to Europe route, that those booking volumes were up, and then this shows the increase in spot rates from China to North Europe. So from the lows, this has been a dramatic increase. It's been from about $1,000 a container to 1,600, and you think, wow, that's a 60% increase. That's really been tremendous. You do have to sort of put that in the context that back a year ago, it's less than it was a year ago, even with this whole Red Sea situation, and way less than it was during the pandemic. If you scroll out further, it was 10 to 15,000. So it's still like 10, a little over 10% of its absolute high during the pandemic. So it is up a lot, up from a very low level. And I guess the way that you would interpret that. I mean, another interesting thing is you look at some of the stock prices; those have bounced from a high level. If you want to look at Zim, the stock chart on Zim, I think, which that's bounced from its low. That's been almost a double from its absolute low. If you could trade that close to $6 now, it's at 11.05, up about 12% for the day. That is down from $24 in February or March. So the idea is that longer routes takes capacity out of the industry that supports rates. So it's been good for the stocks. I mean, those are stocks where there's really a lot of speculation because they move so much. But I guess the way this would potentially mean for intermodal would be would it potentially encourage more shipments from China to the U.S. West Coast rather than China to the U.S. East Coast. One of the things that Greg Miller talked about was that there were some ships that would have gone from China to the U.S. East Coast through the Panama Canal, that all water route through the Panama Canal, but because of the drought in the Panama Canal, that some of those had been rerouted from China through the Suez and the Red Sea, and so that was temporarily, creating more demand for use of the Red Sea. So potentially, all these situations could create more demand for imports into the West Coast. Both of those, both the Panama Canal situation and the Red Sea situation, potentially leading to more intermodal. You think of the containers hit the West Coast of the U.S., 65 to 70% of those go intermodal versus the ones that go hit the East Coast ports. Maybe only 20 or 25% of those go intermodal because those are just closer to the population centers. So it's hard to make look at any data right now because it's a slow week during the holidays and say that that's created a bounce in intermodal volume, and there's time delay from there with accounting for the vessels, but potentially it could be good for first quarter intermodal volumes. Do you have any thoughts on this situation?
Yeah, well, I think, for sure, I think, keeping track of the FreightWaves website and, what Greg Miller writes and other, and others who might be looking at the issue, that's certainly something to keep in mind. Because even we had a meeting this morning, and Greg was talking about just how the situation is evolving right now, and Maersk is actually saying, well, actually, we're not going to go through the Red Sea after all. So it just there's so much there's so much that happens every day, and even like within the day. So it's good to sort of keep track of what's going on with what we're producing on our website.
Yeah, so we'll continue to do that. And then, what else are you working on to write it for the site?
Yeah. So hopefully this week, I will be publishing the issues that rail stakeholders are looking at in 2024. It's sort of, what do you call it? Spoiler alert! It's very similar to what they saw in 2023. So it's also a very long story. There are like 7 articles in one big story. So if you have insomnia and you need, you can go up, pull up the story and have some bedtime reading, and I will put you to sleep. I don't know if it's a good or bad thing, but yeah. So in other words, it's actually lots of information in that. I was able to speak with several people, within the rail sphere, but also the shippers and unions as well. So I feel like it's a neat sort of comprehensive look into the various issues into 2024. And I'm sure that there are others out there too that I might have missed, but that's for starters. That's you can check out that story. And what else? Oh, and I think there's also just kind of, I spoke recently with someone, sort of looking at sort of their thoughts on the intermodal market in 2024. I think, a lot of people so far are, and Mike, you probably have more thoughts about this than I do, but like, there's still some pressure on rail and intermodal in 2024, at least the first half, and the second half might some see some sort of improvement, but just some thoughts on just how things might look in the first half of the year. So those are the 2 things I'm working on right now, and then of course Greenbrier has its earnings, and then we have the fourth quarter results in late January, and of course I'm trying to think if that's when the when the railroads give their 2024 outlook, or is that April? I'm not sure, since it's fourth quarter. But
I think when they report the fourth quarter, they start reporting right after Martin Luther King's birthday, and usually we'll do their outlook for the 2024 along with their capital envelope, all those things. So it's a good time to listen to those conference calls, even though that's can be a tedious task. So everyone, go check out that article, and hope everyone has a good day.